Long before the first clod of earth trembled into the shape of man, before mountains settled into their final posture and oceans forgot the heat of their making, the world belonged to those born of smokeless flame. They were called by many names, jinn, Banu al-Jan, Marid, Ifrit, but in the oldest tongues they were not named at all. They were simply understood as movement without body, intelligence without clay, fire that had learned to think. They arose from a wind that did not behave like wind. It was not cold air in motion, but a vibrating current of heat and pressure, as though the world itself had once been struck like a stringed instrument and never stopped resonating. From that trembling breath came the first awakenings of the jinn, scattered across a young earth still forming its bones. Where they gathered, matter responded, sand melted into glass, stone sweated molten veins, and entire regions of land glowed like embers beneath a thin skin of crust. In that earliest age, there were no quiet landscapes. The world was unstable, alive with eruption and transformation. Great cities rose without architecture, formed instead by collective will, towers of obsidian thrust upward like frozen lightning, vast plains of black glass reflecting a sky always dimmed by ash and heat shimmer. Rivers of molten rock cut across continents like arteries of fire. The jinn did not build as men would later build. They cohered reality around intention, shaping matter the way breath shapes smoke. They called their dominion the Age of Vehement Flame. Across this age, their tribes multiplied and divided. The Banu Gailan descended into cavern networks that reached deeper than memory, where underground fires cast flickering intelligence upon stone walls that seemed to breathe. The Banu Kamakim climbed serrated mountain chains where the air itself was thin and sharp enough to cut thought into clarity or madness.
The Banu al-Jan spread across the open burning plains, where heat rose in waves so intense that distance itself became uncertain, and horizons wavered like water. Between them rose the Marids, not a tribe but a condition, those jinn who mastered vastness. They did not merely rule cities, they ruled storms, deserts, and entire atmospheric currents. When they spoke, thunder answered in delayed obedience. When they moved, pressure systems shifted across continents. Their wars were not fought with weapons but with environment itself. A conflict between tribes could turn forests into vitrified wastelands in moments, or cause entire mountain ranges to fracture and reassemble elsewhere. The sky during their age was rarely calm, it bore constant bruises of heat and pressure, as though the earth below was arguing with the heavens above. Life in that world was not limited to jinn alone. It was also the age of colossal beasts. Creatures not yet refined by later extinction, still carrying the raw excess of early creation. Armored behemoths moved like walking continents, their hides layered with mineral plates formed over centuries of heat exposure. Feathered predators, the Anka among them, stretched wings so vast that entire regions fell into temporary night when they passed overhead. There were serpents that coiled through volcanic trenches, feeding on magma itself, and beasts whose breath exhaled chemical storms that reshaped terrain. The jinn did not hunt these creatures in the human sense. They entered them. Through what they called vibration, the imposition of will into living structure, they bound their consciousness to these beasts, turning them into extensions of themselves. A Marid riding a volcanic colossus did not steer it, he became its inner command. Entire battalions could move through the sky on the backs of Anka, while others traveled underground within beasts that burrowed through molten layers of the earth. It was an age of power without restraint, and eventually, without meaning. Because beneath all their dominion, corruption spread. The jinn began to fracture not only into tribes, but into philosophies of dominance. Some believed the world existed to be shaped endlessly. Others believed it was a shared inheritance requiring balance. The first group always won. War became constant. Not wars of survival, but wars of expansion, pride, and remembrance. The Banu Gailan raided the Banu Kamakim's peaks not for resources but for humiliation. The Banu al-Jan burned entire valleys simply to erase the memory of rival presence. The Marids escalated conflicts until even weather patterns became weapons. The earth itself began to suffer under the strain. Rivers of lava cooled into black scars. Entire ecosystems of fireborne life collapsed into ash fields. The lesser spirits, the jinn, creatures more closely tied to soil and boundary than flame, were caught in this escalation and annihilated almost entirely, their existence reduced to fragmentary whispers in surviving memory. And then came the turning of the heavens. The sky did not intervene gently. It descended in force. Beings of pure light, angels not bound by physical form, entered the lower world like descending decrees. They did not carry weapons because reality itself obeyed them. Wherever they moved, structures of jinn civilization collapsed not through destruction but through redefinition. Cities of obsidian ceased to be cities. Storms of merit origin dissolved mid-formation. Beasts bound by vibration broke free and fled into extinction. The great war of the heavens was not loud in the way jinn wars had been. It was absolute. Silence followed its passage like a wound that refuses to close. Many jinn were destroyed. Others were exiled into the furthest regions of existence, into ocean depths where pressure erased memory, into barren horizons beyond mapped earth, and into the boundary mountain that would later be called Kaf.
The emerald ring that encircles the world in myth and cosmography. Among those who fell from grace during this transition was Aazil, a being of unusual discipline and devotion. Unlike many of his kin, he had studied the order of creation, rising through ranks of knowledge until he stood among the angels in proximity, though never in essence. His fire had been refined into something resembling contemplation. But refinement does not erase origin. When the command came for all beings to bow before Adam, the being fashioned from clay, Aazil's certainty fractured. He saw in himself fire, mobile, luminous, superior in his understanding, and in Adam, still form, still silence. The comparison hardened into pride. I am of fire, he is of clay. That thought alone became the pivot of his fall. Refusal followed, and refusal became exile. His name, once Aazil, became Iblis, the one severed from mercy. From that moment, his purpose aligned against humanity, not out of random malice, but out of wounded metaphysical pride. He would not destroy mankind at once, he would demonstrate its supposed unworthiness across time. After the fall of the jinn's ancient dominion, the world entered a slower age. Humanity emerged gradually, fragile but persistent, rising from clay into awareness. The jinn no longer ruled openly. Instead, they withdrew into the margins of existence. Places where structure weakened and reality thinned, they became inhabitants of thresholds, abandoned ruins, deserts where heat erased direction, mountains where sound failed to return correctly, and empty houses where memory lingered longer than presence. Their nature adapted. No longer able to shape continents, they shaped perception. Their greatest weapon became whisper. They learned to enter human cognition not as external beings but as internal suggestions. Waswasa. Subtle insertion of thought that feels self-generated, became their art. They no longer needed to appear in visible form, they only needed to tilt desire slightly off balance. Some jinn retained older practices. They entered dreams as strangers too perfect to be questioned. They observed human families, especially those fractured by grief or isolation. They understood that loneliness created openings. In such spaces, they could mirror human longing back into human minds until desire became confusion. There were stories. Persistent, unverified, but never fully dismissed, that some interactions crossed boundaries too deeply. That in rare circumstances, forms of union occurred between jinn and humans. From such unions, legends describe beings neither fully spirit nor fully mortal, Nephilim in some traditions, giants or mighty ones in others. These beings were said to carry excessive strength and instability, consuming land and order until collapse followed them like shadow. Whether literal or symbolic, these stories reflect a recurring fear, that boundaries between realms should not be crossed. Even as humanity grew, the unseen world remained structured by older hierarchies. Among the most enduring of these was Kaf, the encircling mountain said to border creation itself. It was described as emerald in hue, not from vegetation but from a light that had no origin in sun or fire. It stood as both prison and throne. Within its interior were said to be chambers of impossible depth where certain merits remained bound, and vaults containing objects not fully belonging to time, jars that held fragments of possible futures, rings capable of binding spirits, and maps that led not to places but to outcomes. At the center of Kaf's order ruled Malak Gatchin, a sovereign whose authority was not political in human terms but structural. He did not govern subjects so much as regulate balance. Beneath him were lesser kings aligned with cosmic cycles, forces tied to days, planets, and symbolic influences that bled into human perception through fortune, war. Their influence was not direct, but atmospheric. It reached the world through ruins like Iram, the city of pillars, where brass architecture still stood in imagination if not in geography, and through deserts where travelers felt decisions already being made before they chose. As time passed, the jinn world settled into stratification. The Banu Gailan traded in echoes and hidden knowledge. The Banu Kamakim engineered siege-like phenomena in mountain regions. The Banu Aljan built cities that existed partially in molten states, shifting between solidity and heat depending on will. They were no longer world shapers, but world influencers. And yet the ancient urge remained. On rare occasions, groups of jinn attempted once more to ascend toward the heavens. They formed living ladders of combined will, stacking intelligence upon intelligence in defiance of the sealed sky. For brief moments, they touched fragments of celestial information. Single truths detached from context. But the response was immediate and final. Burning streaks of light, Shihab, fell upon them, severing ascent and erasing stolen knowledge mid-transit. From that moment onward, the boundary was absolute. Heaven would no longer be approached through force or stealth. What remained was the lower world, shared uneasily between clay and flame, presence and absence, seen and unseen. And beneath it all, the older order continued to breathe quietly through cracks.